Hello and welcome to another episode of the Our Foundations podcast. My name is Joshua, and today's episode will be an introduction to Season 5. This is, I guess, more of an announcement than an actual full episode, but this is to introduce you to what we are going to be covering in Season 5. And thank you for your patience. I haven't done an episode the past 2 weeks. As you probably know, if you've been listening, I'm in the middle of setting up a brand new venture. It has a lot of moving pieces, and that has taken up pretty much all my time. But I am back, and I had wrapped up Season 4 last we left off 2 weeks ago, and now we can pick up with what Season 5 is going to look like. So coming into Season 4, we've basically covered the evolution of our society, of all the systems within it, everything from how they started to alternative movements going on today. I did that in a fairly chronological order in Season 1. Then from a parallel perspectives, I guess, historical look in Season 2, comparing the Reformation time period to now. Again, trying to understand the evolution of our society, what we're going through, where we're headed. And the interim period in between there was all about kind of where we're headed and historical patterns. And after that interim between Season 2 and Season 3, I got into Season 3 and looked at the example of the early church and how they treated the situation they found themselves in, where they had major disagreements with the state, with the culture, with the institutional religion. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They felt that they were corrupt and in many ways immoral, and they chose not to fight it, not to join it and change it from the inside, but rather to create something different and better and new and right and moral and good. And so they chose the parallel society approach. And that is what was carried into Season 4, which was the one we just left off with, where I looked at everything that had been covered on this podcast from the beginning, Episode 1, up until the beginning of Season 4, and took a step back, looked at it all from a more macro perspective, and tried to tie a lot of the pieces together, bring a lot of stuff up to date, add in some more information, look at it from different perspectives, different points of views, all from this parallel society approach. And that was Season 4 that just wrapped up. So Season 5 is going to be looking at these types of topics and philosophies and these types of things from a biblical Christian perspective. So what I am going to be doing is going through various aspects of biblical scripture and going through these concepts, these topics, these approaches, and trying to answer this question of how then do we live, given that we are also currently living in a crazy world. We're in clown world, and it's largely corrupt. It is largely immoral, and those of us on the side that I'm coming from, at least, don't really want to have anything to do with it. That includes the state. That includes mega corporations. That includes some branches of the church. That includes a lot. So again, similar to the original Christian church, we find ourselves in this predicament as well. And so since I've covered all of this from a more practical perspective, I've covered it from a secular perspective, I've covered it from an historical perspective, I want to now cover it from a biblical, theological perspective. So since I am a Christian and a lot of this is built on those Christian values and a biblical perspective, that's the approach that I'll be taking for Season 5. So while that is the case, if you are not a Christian and this is not a religion that you subscribe to, I'm sure that you could still glean some very good insight and get the philosophy and the points. And if you've stuck with it till now, then you very well might still be interested. But in general, this is going to be for a Christian audience, or again, anyone that's seeking in any way. And what I'll be doing is starting off by looking at various examples from the Old Testament of, I guess, how do you as a Christian relate to the state? And what approaches can we have, and what should our perspective be? And I'll go through lots of various scripture verses and sections that people will bring up a lot, or that are very applicable, or that are very relevant, and talk about those from this perspective. So the examples that I should be covering, at least the rough outline I have now, are Adam and Eve, number one, start at the beginning. Noahide law, that's one that a lot of people try to cite for, or do cite, for why government should be a good thing and how God ordained government. And so I'll talk about that. And then Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. Arguably, that might have been the first king and the first empire. Then Joseph, who actually got involved with the empire of Egypt, and what all went down there and why, and some of that backstory. Then Mosaic law, which was basically God's dictate for, if you are going to organize a society and run it, this is a governance system that you should use. This is how you should do it. And so what does God directly say about how you organize a society, especially in comparison to a government the way we think of it today? Then I'll go over Judges, which is the exact opposite, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And let's see how that went. Then we've got the kings of Israel, where, now we've got these great kings. Let's elect a king. And yeah, we know how that goes. But I'll cover all that and go over those examples, again, from this perspective of how do we look at this issue of dealing with an immoral and corrupt society and trying to build out a parallel society that is good and that is better. How do we look at this from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective? What is the theology behind it? That's the approach I'm getting into. So the next section will be on Daniel. So you've got Daniel himself, who was also a part of an empire and played a role of some sort of role within that government. Then you have Daniel's prophecy, which does also get into various aspects of God's opinion of governments and empires. Then you have, finally, God's use of other nations, where there are many times in Scripture where it says God used these other nations, these other governments, these other kings to do certain things. And so we need to talk about that. So those are all the things through the Old Testament that I want to cover. There might be a few more that I did not mention, but that's the rough outline at least. We'll go through all those things and get a good background and perspective here, and then we'll shift into the New Testament. And the main thing we'll be covering here will be the Sermon on the Mount. So what I will likely start with will be going through the book of Matthew, at least sections of it. So I won't do the entire thing, but the first thing that I plan on covering is the temptations of Christ, and looking at what we can glean from those passages about the Christian's relationship to the state and God's view of the state or governments. And so we can go through the temptations of Christ, then that will take us right into the Sermon on the Mount, which chronologically is roughly the next thing that happens. And so within the Sermon on the Mount, that's got a lot to go through there. That's going to take a very long time. I imagine by the time we're done with the Sermon on the Mount, that will be the equivalent of an entire season of this podcast, probably just with the Sermon on the Mount. That's my guess. But with that, you've got the Beatitudes, you've got the sections on salt and light, you've got sections on the law, you have these principles from the law, you've got a few on murder, anger, and dispute, you've got a few on adultery, divorce, and oaths, and then a few on justice, response, and love. And then we've got the kingdom perspective that Yeshua explains, and then he talks about applying these principles, and that gets us through the Sermon on the Mount and brings us into the parables. So at least my rough idea, and I'm not 100% positive that I'll cover this, but I would really like to get into the parables of Yeshua and the parables that he tells. I will probably have to talk about where he addresses taxation. That might fit into other sections, but I don't think that it does with the Sermon on the Mount. So that'll probably be separate, again, directly addressing something related to how you interact with the state. taxes. And so he does address that. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about the trial of Yeshua. At least this is the rough outline. Again, this is definitely subject to modification here. But we've got Jesus' trial, and he does talk about his kingdom and the difference between his kingdom and the earthly kingdoms. And there are a few very good bits to draw out of that. Now, if we continue from there, I do have a rough outline of other things that I would want to cover and continue on with this more Bible study type approach. So the next things that I think would be very, very valuable to cover would be Romans chapters 12, 13, and 14. So we've got Romans 13 is the big one, but the surrounding chapters are very important as well. Then we've got some verses in 1 Peter, and specifically I would cover chapter 2 and chapter 3, but there are verses that directly talk about how to deal with and interact with the government, the state, the kings. What do you do? Do you pray for them? Well, yes, you do. And do you submit to them? Well, yes, you do. But does that mean that you support them and you join them? Well, no, you don't. But we'll go over that because there are specific verses about that there, as well as in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and 2, and in Titus chapter 2 and 3. Those are all things that address these topics. Then you've got 1 Corinthians 15 has some applicable passages. 2 Corinthians 10 has applicable passages, as well as Ephesians chapter 5. Then the other sections that I thought would be very applicable would be Acts. So that's talking directly about the original church, the early church, specifically chapter 2, chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6. Then, if we continue on from there, there are two that I would bring back in from the Old Testament. That would be Lamentations chapter 3 and the entire book of Ecclesiastes, basically Stoic philosophy. And these would be the final things that would wrap up this Bible study of sorts. So that's the plan. That is what we are going to start doing starting in the following episode. That is roughly the outline for Season 5. And hopefully it's something that you will really enjoy and get a lot out of. And I would love to hear feedback, as always, from you as I get started into this study. So, with that, I will just say thank you for listening. Thank you for the support of those financially supporting on Patreon or Subscribestar, and those who have given money directly through PayPal or crypto. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I appreciate any feedback that has been given and that will be given. That is extremely helpful for me. And please do leave a rating and a review as you go. And finally, if you are new to this podcast, I would highly recommend, I believe it's the episode before this, the last episode of Season 4, where I go over basically an outline of the entire podcast from start to finish, all the things that have been covered. And if you listen to that episode, that'll give you a good feel for what you may or may not be interested in listening to in the backlog. Ideally, you go back to episode 1 and work your way through, but I understand that that is a lot of content to go through if you are just now being introduced to this show. But that will give you a good feel of what's there. So with that, until next time, I'm out. Peace.
This has been Our Foundations Podcast. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.